Let's take some time to try to understand and analyze qualitative data from chapters 15 and 16 in your textbook. Qualitative analysis can be challenging, and in many ways, it is much more challenging than quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis, you have numbers, and your numbers really do give you your answer, and you depend on those numbers to give you an answer. In qualitative analysis, there really are no universal rules. You need to set your design in advance, and you need to be prepared for a whole lot of work because it's not one analysis. It may require reading hundreds of pages of data over and over and searching for understanding. You may think you understand it, and then you come back and you look at it the next time and you make some adjustments. You also usually have more than one person looking at the data. What you hope to see is patterns, and then take those patterns and weave them together. The downside, there really is no handy table of numbers to explain the findings. One of the things that you really need to do when you're doing qualitative data is you need to develop a coding scheme. I always highly recommend that when you're doing qualitative data analysis, you now use one of the tools that you can get online, such as NVivo, that will help you through this process. Tools like NVivo are very good at, first of all, giving you a place that once your interviews or your observations are coded and transcribed, you can take those and you can upload them into your software. You generally start out with the stage of pre-coding, where you're trying to get to know what your data is. In NVivo, there is a query command, and it is a good tool that you can use that helps you to identify words that participants may have used. You can even do word frequencies, and I'm sure you've seen these little graphic images that people will use of word frequencies. This is sometimes helpful for you. You can also then create things that look like mind maps that just give you a little flow chart of thoughts and ideas that came up in the interviews. The next piece is the coding stage. And with the coding stage, you are looking for consistency of the codes and the nodes that are generated, and this is very crucial to you. Finally, in the post-coding stage, one of the things you do is you present your data. And you are basically trying to find a way to present your themes. Let's walk through this table a little bit, or this graphic that I created. You can see NVivo in the center, but you start with the qualitative researcher who is also your coder. You go into this with experiences and intent and background, and then you engage in the coding process of the data. At the same time, one of the things you hope is to gain credibility by being transparent in the coding process. Most people, in fact, everybody I know, creates a code book. By making clear your creating process, you're basically demonstrating how you arrived at your findings. This is really important when you want to publish your findings. You take your data and you identify relevant information using your coding methods. You put them into containers called nodes, and this is what they're called in vivo, and then you label those nodes. From there, you can generate categories and themes and create models and illustrations. All of this comes together in a way that represents your data, and it gives you some ability to graphically represent qualitative data. I always find this very helpful. Let's think about how you might look at data from the different perspectives. Ethnographic analysis basically is the research technique you use for people in a specific environment. Bruno Latour did an ethnographic analysis at the Pasteur Institute. He was interested in scientists. So here was a sociologist. He was studying scientists. And what would I do with ethnography? Well, ethnographic research is valuable when a researcher hopes to learn about the complexities and idiosyncrasies of an environment from a first-hand experience. So in the Bruno Latour example, he wanted to learn about scientists at the Pasteur Institute, so he embedded himself with them. In many ways, this is what some journalists have done when they embed themselves with military units. You can see in this analysis steps 1 through 8 that starts by identifying your research question. Then you determine the locations of your research. Bruno Latour's was the Pasteur Institute. Step 3, you formulate your presentation method so you can consider the most effective way to obtain objective information. This may be by interviews, this may be by taking field notes and observations. One of the things to keep in mind is that people can recognize that you're a researcher, and when people recognize this, it may impact the way they behave. Step 4 is you have to require permission and access. So you will need an IRB, and you need permission from the location where you will be. You need to observe and participate. Ethnography requires more than just observation. To research effectively, you want to participate in the organization you are researching in some capacity. Step 6 is the interview. To increase your understanding of behaviors and actions, interviews may be necessary. It doesn't mean they're always necessary, but they may be necessary. Determine who is the best to interview and what questions. Sometimes we refer to this as key informants, and we decide in advance what we want to ask them. We want to collect archival data. So many organizations and communities and cultures, they have a lot of documents and data. You always want to collect that data and make sure you're reviewing it as well. And there are many sources of data, from physical documents to emails to records of phone conversations to media data that organizations have put out. And finally, you want to code and analyze the data. And again, coding is critical, and your textbook walks you through an example of a coding process. In a phenomenological analysis, you start with individual transcripts and you read and look for significant phases that can be extracted. The researcher then identifies any emergent themes from these phrases. The themes from all the transcripts are collected together, and possible connections between the themes are noted. Then the researcher checks the original transcripts to assess whether the themes are supported by sufficient evidence in participants' actual discourse, and because it's qualitative research, you start the process all over again. It's never the case that you only look at your data once. And then finally, in grounded theory, it is a little bit different perspective. And I provided you this table from an article on using grounded theory to study human aspects of software engineering, because, surprisingly, software engineers find grounded theory very useful. And I provided you the link to the full article if you want to look at it. But you do start out and you look at all of this, you will notice this involves a literature review. And they start with an initial literature review to see what already exists. And then they walk through the process of open coding and meming. And so open coding is the first step of the analysis, and it starts by collating any of the key points of data that have been collected. And you are always doing this constant comparison. Now you probably say, what in the world is memoing and memoing? And basically what this is doing is this process of taking theoretical notes throughout the process. And you are doing a constant comparison. So you notice data collection, memoing, open coding, and the constant comparison is cyclical. It is forever informing the researcher. You then create your core categories, and then you go to selective coding, and again memoing, and then the constant comparison. So you realize, again, you're never looking at your data just once. You then do an extensive review, and you want to look for saturation. And what does saturation essentially mean? Simply stated, saturation is when you realize you're getting the same information repeated and you are seeing themes in the information you are gathering. And as always, it ends with this wrap-up. So grounded theory is a research method developed by sociologists Glasser and Strauss in 1967, and it allows the researcher to systematically generate theory from data analyzed by these constant comparisons. And if you notice in this graphic, you see the constant comparisons repeated. One of the things that is important is to look at the comparison of alternative grounded theory approaches. And in your textbook, in Table 15.2, it gives you a comparison of Glasser, Corbin and Strauss, and Charmans. And the way they did their initial data analysis, their types of coding, the connections between the categories and the strategies, and the outcomes. The important thing for you to recognize here is there isn't one right way. There are multiple ways to do this. So Glasser started out by breaking down and conceptualizing data and comparing that to and looking for patterns to emerge. You will notice that Charmas, on the other hand, was creating a link between collecting data and developing an emergent theory. It's a slightly different approach. They used different types of coding. While they largely use some open coding, Glasser used more selective and theoretical coding, and Charmas was more initial and focused. And the big thing is look at the outcomes. Glasser was looking at emergent theory or discovery. Corbin and Strauss were looking at verification. And Chalmers was looking at an interpretive theory constructed through researchers' past and present involvement with persons, perspectives, and research practices. There are similarities, but there are differences. So remember when you're reviewing articles, they don't all have to be the same. What we want, though, is for the findings to be trustworthy. And we talk about trustworthiness in qualitative research because there is no universally agreed upon vocabulary for quality. And it is important to address quality of research. Some of the quality criteria that we look for are credibility. So we want to be confident in the truth of the findings. Dependability, meaning that we're looking for reliability of data over times and conditions. Confirmability, we're looking for objectivity and congruence between two or more independent people about the accuracy, relevance, and meaning of the data. Remember earlier when I said it's rarely the case that only one person looks at the data? If you want confirmability, you need more than one person to agree on what your data is telling you. Transferability is the extent to which findings are applicable in other settings or groups. We don't generally do research that we can't transfer to other groups. In quantitative research, we call it generalizability. But in qualitative research, we tend to refer to transferability. And then authenticity, the feeling and tones of participants' lives as they are lived. One of the things we will do in qualitative research is we will use exact words from the participants. We don't change their words into what we think they mean. We use their actual wording because we want it to be authentic. We want it to represent their lives as they live them, not our interpretation of their lives and how we think they have lived them. If you look at table 16.1, quality enhancement strategies, this is really wonderful when you're doing your own qualitative research, and it's wonderful because it breaks it down by credibility, dependability, confirmability, transferability, and authenticity, and it gives you strategies to improve those things. One of the things, if you look in throughout the inquiry, is careful documentation and an audit trail. And that basically is really important to dependability and confirmability. You need to be able to tell people how you did your work, and you need to well document it. How many times as nurses have we heard if you didn't write it down, you didn't do it, right? It's the same thing in research. You need really good documentation. In your data collection, one of the things that gives you credibility is prolonged engagement. And if you look through these, one of the things that's down further is saturation of data. And saturation means you've done enough interviews, you've done enough interactions that you're starting to get themes. You can't do one interview and have a theme. You probably can't do 3 or 4 and have a theme. But when you get to 25 or 30, you're likely going to have enough data that you can see themes, and this improves your credibility. If you look all the way down, one of the things that you want is your presentations of finding, and you want to make sure there is documentation of quality enhancement efforts. And you need to do this so that you have both credibility and transferability. If you can't show you've made an effort for quality and to enhance the quality of your work, first of all, you're probably not going to get your article published or your findings published. And second of all, people are always going to wonder what you actually did and how you did it. And then finally, I will bring us back to box 16.1, guidelines for critically appraising quality and integrity in qualitative research. This is really important. The researcher must earn the trust of the reader. We often talk of the art and the science of nursing, but in qualitative research, we also consider the art and the science. This may be why it is so attractive to nursing, because it is considered by its nature holistic, and nursing is by its nature holistic. You want to know, did the report discuss efforts to enhance and evaluate the quality of the data and the overall inquiry? Did they give you a description that was sufficient that you could understand what they were talking about and what they did? And do you think that there was enough detail that you can draw inferences about the quality of the data, the analysis, and the interpretation? You want to know about their specific techniques to enhance trustworthiness and integrity of the inquiry. And if you go back to the previous table, you can go down that checklist and you can find some of those. Did the researcher adequately represent the multiple realities of those being studied? In other words, do they seem authentic? It is rarely the case that everybody is going to agree on everything in an interview. If everybody already agrees on everything, and we know that, then the research is probably pointless. But what you want to do is make sure that you are looking at everything people say and not just what you may have originally hoped to find. Given the efforts to enhance data quality, what can you conclude about the study's validity, integrity, rigor, and trustworthiness? This is really important because when you read a study, if you're the reviewer for a journal, you want to answer these things before you basically say, yes, this should be published. But even as a reader, you need to know that sometimes bad studies slip through. And you need to be able to ask yourself questions like this when you're reading a study. There is a professor out in Portland, I believe, that's in big trouble because he submitted to journals, reputable journals, these outrageous articles. There is no doubt they were fake. In fact, they look like something that might have been published in The Onion, if you know what The Onion was, which is kind of this spoof on news. Anybody with an objective eye would have known that they weren't real, and yet they got published, largely because they bought into a party line people wanted to hear. Well, the professor got in trouble, but what you want to say is, why is the person that showed this problem the one that's in trouble, rather than the people that were publishing what was clearly not even really science? So it's really important as both a reader and a reviewer to have a critical eye and ask yourself these questions. And finally, did the researcher discuss the study's implications for clinical practice for future research? As nurses, we always want to know, what are the implications for our practice? You did the research. Tell me what it means for those that we provide care to, and how might it change or inform our practice?